Hi, and welcome to this video where I'm going to be teaching you how to construct a floral applique blouse, a peplum blouse, just as you see here. And this is actually a part of a video series in which we're doing a two-piece ensemble, a floral applique two-piece ensemble, and we've already gone ahead and constructed the actual gathered skirt here. And I'm going to go ahead and link to those videos in the description box down below so you can sort of get caught up if you want to follow along. Now, in making this actual peplum blouse, I'm going to break it up into two pieces. The first piece, I'm going to actually show you how to sort of semi-draft your own bodice for this blouse. And then the second part, I'm going to actually teach you to draft the peplum for it. By all means, feel free to use whatever pattern you have at your disposal, especially if you want to follow along and you actually have a bodice that you feel would work well. This is just a simple darted bodice with some long sleeves, so nothing fancy. You can find many patterns that will work for this. I am going to teach you, however, how to take a vogue fitting shell, which we used for the skirt, the underskirt construction in the previous videos of this series. So I'm going to use this pattern again because it's basically almost like a sloper. So I'm going to teach you how to come from a basic bodice pattern to this design up here. And this is just to sort of make the design accessible for everyone. So if you already have a bodice or even a full peplum blouse pattern that you want to use, then you really don't need to follow along until later videos in this series. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually trace off this bodice front piece onto new pattern paper. Okay, which is what I've done here. You want to make sure that you're not including those seam allowances. Remember, because we're going to be manipulating the pattern, we actually cut along the stitching line. That's what we're going to be working from. So no seam allowances in our new pattern piece. And also, I would recommend that you go ahead and you make up a muslin of the full bodice as is, and you tweak it however you need. Make sure that it fits well, because we want to be working with something that actually fits as best we can get it before we go manipulating it further, right? Now this is going to be our basic sort of sloper that we're going to work from. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new neckline. And we're going to tamper with the shoulder a bit because when we lower the neckline, inevitably we cut a bit into the shoulder as well. So the main point that I'm going to address in this video is that of gaping. And whenever you take a high-rise neckline and you lower it, you're probably going to get some gaping depending on how much you lower it. The reason this occurs is because if you think about it, our body is not a straight line, right? Our body is comprised of dips and shallows, hollows, in this case, because our chest sort of has a concave formation between the shoulder and the bust point, okay? And usually that's not visible when you have the actual fabric hanging from the full shoulder, because it has the full support of the shoulder to just sort of cascade over those hollows and onward over the bust. But the minute you start actually dropping the neckline, you start dropping into the hollow of your chest, okay? And that means that it's because you don't have the support, the fabric doesn't have the support of the full shoulder, well, then it's going to create the gaping because it's not fitting as closely as it needs to the body for support. And that's what causes it, okay? Once you lose any sort of support from the shoulder, you start getting into maybe there will be gaping. So this is just always something to keep in mind. And I'm going to show you a technique for neckline gaping that deals with something called bust radius and contour guidelines. And that's sort of the technical information that's going to help you sort of clear up as much of the gaping that you might encounter before you actually go to make your pattern. What we're going to do now is we're going to first decide what we want our neckline to look like, okay? And if you'll recall from my little sketch here, I want a pretty basic scooped neckline. And from this, I'm sort of going to gauge the measurements that I want out of this. And I'm going to say that I want my neckline in the center front to drop about 2 inches. And I want the actual neckline to hit up in the shoulder area about 3 inches from the shoulder tip. So now I'm just going to try and connect the two marks that I've made, creating a sort of rounded neckline. Sort of sketch out the silhouette that you want, making sure that you have sort of 90-degree angle perpendicular intersections at the center front and that shoulder tip. And now that we have our new neckline drawn in, you'll notice that obviously the shoulder has been intersected. And because of that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to try and take a little off the shoulder initially. And this is just a good guideline to follow. You'll find the midpoint of the shoulder. Okay, so I just take the shoulder and I fold it in half from the neckline, the old neckline, to the tip of the shoulder. I put a crease, drop down about 1/8 of an inch from that little mark you made. From this point to the shoulder tip here, you're gonna have it sort of taper on out to that shoulder tip, okay? So from 1/8 of an inch down to nothing. For the other side is the same thing. You're gonna go from that midpoint of the shoulder where you drop down about 1/8 of an inch, and you're gonna taper to nothing at the old neckline, okay? Not your new neckline, the old neckline. And this newly constructed line now serves as a gauge for how much you want to deduct from the shoulder based on the new neckline you've drawn. So you see where our new neckline intersects this sort of guideline that we've just drawn? That's how much we're gonna want to remove, okay? So right here, I would say still about 1/8 of an inch. Here I drew a fat 1/8 of an inch. So here about 1/8 of an inch, and then we're gonna follow this line on out. And make that line really clear that from here, where my new neckline meets my shoulder, taper it out to nothing. So I'm really just subtracting a scant 1/8 of an inch onward down to nothing at the shoulder tip, and that will serve as our new shoulder seam line. Now we need to try and clear up the actual gaping that's going to occur in this neckline area. In order to get a good guide of how much we need to be taking off, I mean, the best way to do this is actually once you determine the neckline you want in the front as well as the back, you go ahead, you make a muslin, and you pin out any sort of gaping that occurs, and you make little sort of mini darts in the neckline when you pin it out in your muslin, and then you transfer that to your actual paper, and then you will end up doing the technique that I will teach you later on in this video. That is the best way. But here is the technical way that can really help you sort of prevent those gaping necklines before they even start. So first off, what you're gonna do is you're gonna wanna try and calculate something called the bust radius. So here's a little sketch I've made that basically outlines what exactly the bust radius is. Here you can see the chest and the actual bust and the bust apex here, about where the nipple will occur. And then you have the underbust where it hits the rib cage, okay? So the bust radius is measuring from the apex of the bust to the underbust where your rib cage is. So you'll take a tape measure, wearing whatever bra that you intend to wear with the garment, because that can really affect things, and measure that distance. And that is your bust radius. For me, it's about 3 inches. Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna come back to your pattern piece, and because we already have our bust apex outlined on our pattern piece, what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure from the bust apex in a circular fashion all the way around it, whatever the bust radius was that you measured. As I mentioned, for me, it was 3 inches. So if you have a compass for this, that's fabulous. It'll make it go super quick. But if you don't, you can just take your tape measure, and similar to how you would, say, do the radius for a circle skirt or something if you're drafting it, you just really want to make a sort of arch along the top, because that's the part of the bust radius that we're going to be using. So here you can see I've etched out my bust radius along the upper portion of my bust, because that's all we're really going to need, as I mentioned. And then our next order of business is to actually draw a vertical line from the midpoint of the old neckline, okay? So around about here, down to one leg of the waistline dart. So now that that's done, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you sort of a standard measure to continue the rest of this process. Now, I'm gonna say that we're gonna measure on over along this bust radius line from this line that we just drew about 1/4 inch. Okay, and I've already gone ahead and sort of marked that. You can see right there, 1/4 inch from that line on the bust radius. At that specific location along the bust radius, that's the measurement of the depth of the hollow that exists, okay? And that's a standard measurement. Now, you can go ahead and try and take this measurement yourself. It's a bit finicky to take. I would recommend having 2 people to do it. So if you're unable to do that, go with the 1/4 inch standard guideline. It's gonna help clear up some gaping at the neckline. It's gonna give you a good starting point. So now that we have that 1/4 inch marked, what we're gonna do from here is basically create 2 dart-like shapes. One is going to extend from this mark here up to our old neckline. I'm gonna taper off to a point, and then we're gonna do the exact same thing, but draw down to the tip of the waistline dart. Once again, come to a point at that waistline dart from that mark, that 1/4 inch mark on the bust radius. So now that we have our little dart-like shapes drawn in, they allow us to see how much we need to deduct from our new neckline. The space that exists between these 2 legs of our neckline dart, if you will, that is the amount that we need to take out. In my case, it's about 1/8 of an inch here. And so if you can see how if you have necklines that drop lower, you see how they'll cross where there's a greater distance between these 2 lines. So the lower you go towards that bust radius, you'll see you have to take out a little more each time, the more and more you drop that neckline for the neckline ease, because it will gape more. So that's how this sort of system works. And as I mentioned, it's just a guideline. You may discover that you may need to take out more ease, and especially if you happen to be working with maybe a fabric that ends up stretching a lot, no matter what you do with it, you may want to just use this sort of as a guideline and then take out a little bit more. You know, that's really up to you. But it's a good starting point to give you an idea of what you need to take out. In order to actually remove this amount from the neckline, what we need to do is just transfer it to the waistline dart. And because, as you see, we basically essentially have 2 darts that we've connected, and that sets us up to do the slash and spread method. First off, we need to trim away the old neckline here, so you're just going to cut along your new neckline, and then while you're at it, we can go ahead and trim away the old shoulder line, and then we're going to cut from the neckline along the straightest leg of the dart that we've made there. So right here, this leg, we're going to cut all the way down to the point of the dart, but not through it. Remember, we want to maintain a little bit of space there for a hinge joint. And then we're going to follow that same line, but begin cutting of the waistline dart on that leg and follow on up, leaving a little hinge joint. Remember, don't cut all the way through. And then we'll have a pattern that we can pivot and rotate such that we can deduct the amount of ease at the new neckline and transfer it to the waistline dart. So now that we're able to sort of freely rotate our pattern piece, what we're going to do is we're going to take that sort of side area, okay, of the pattern piece, that half, and we're going to overlap it such that the legs of the neckline dart meet, okay? You're effectively taping that dart or dart-like shape closed. And when you do, once you tape that down, you can see how you really do effectively transfer that excess that was at the neckline to the waistline dart. So once you go ahead and have your dart legs taped at the neckline, you will notice maybe you have a jog. That's completely okay. We'll end up truing that when we retrace the pattern and add our seam allowances. And then, of course, you may just want to add a little bit of paper here, or just add some tape just to ensure that you maintain that dart shape, that waistline dart. And then we're just going to go ahead, transfer this to a new sheet of pattern paper, trace it off, and then add our seam allowances everywhere but the center front, right? Because the center front we're going to put on a fold line, so we're not going to have a center front seam. And then we're pretty much done with the bodice front. So here we have the bodice back, and just as we did for the bodice front, we're going to go ahead and trace it off onto a separate sheet of pattern paper. Once again, eliminating any sort of seam allowances. We're not going to be working with those, and transferring any sort of critical information. So now the first thing we want to do really back here is trying to determine the neckline for our back bodice. And that's going to coincide with the neckline for the front. And we want to make sure those two meet up at the shoulder point correctly, right? So obviously in the front, if you'll recall, here's the front bodice piece. If you'll recall, I said that I was going to measure in from the shoulder tip about 3 inches to the new neckline. So we're going to do the same thing on the back, right? Because the shoulder tips of this pattern are meeting. We're going to measure in 3 inches from the shoulder tip of the back bodice, just as we did in the front. All right. And we'll find that that 3 inches actually falls within the dart, which means we're going to have to pin out the dart first. I've gone ahead and folded that dart over. And now I can measure my 3 inches in from the shoulder tip. And I find that it falls just about a 1/4 inch on the other side of the dart. Now I need to determine how far down along that center back seam I want my neckline to fall. And I'm thinking 2 inches is pretty good. And now that we have our marks made, we want to connect them to create our rounded neckline. So just as we did in the front, you always want to make sure that we have, as our marks indicate, sort of a 90-degree angle intersection with the shoulder and the center back seam, and then you just want to curve it on out from there. So now that I've roughly etched in my back neckline, we need to decide if we need to remove any excess from the neckline. Because the back is different than the front, there's much less gaping that occurs when we drop the neckline slightly, and this is not a big drop for the back neckline. You really only start to get some noticeable gaping in general when you end up dropping the back neckline. I would say beyond 1/3 of the way down the armhole would be a good guideline. As you can tell from this is above that. So you may not need to really remove anything. However, I know from personal experience, whenever I drop a back neckline, I tend to get gaping. So this is more a personal measurement for me, but I'm going to go ahead and deduct probably about 3/8 of an inch in the back for me. You may only want to do 1/8 of an inch, which would be 1/4 of an inch total across the back neckline, especially if you're working with a loosely woven fabric or something that tends to stretch easily. Maybe it might be worth your while, or maybe you don't need to do anything at all. So I would say if this is your first time, I would make up a muslin, right, with the changes that we made in the front, and then maybe just the neckline that we've altered in the back. See how it fits. If you are experiencing some gaping, then go ahead and do the technique that I will show you as follows, because it's going to be very similar to what we've done in the front. So what we're going to do first in the back here, if we are removing any excess or what we suspect might be excess, we're going to locate sort of the central area of that old neckline. Right around there, sort of the midpoint of the old neckline. And we're going to, just as we did in the front, extend a straight line down to the tip of the waistline dart. And now we do something that's basically essentially what we did in the front, only we don't have that bust radius that we're going to mark out from. Instead, we're going to mark along the actual new neckline. So I said for me, that I tend to like to take out about 3/8 of an inch along my back neckline. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna draw another straight line from that point to the tip of the waistline dart. So this is very similar to what we did in the front. We've effectively created a neckline dart that we can now transfer to the waistline dart. And now before we actually start cutting the dart legs and pivoting the neckline dart closed, I'm gonna go ahead and adjust the shoulder as well. So remember in the front, we actually trimmed off about 1/8 of an inch. On that shoulder seam, we contoured it a bit. Well, we're gonna do the same thing in the back. So we're going to locate the midpoint of the shoulder, fold that in half, sort of make a crease there, and that falls within my dart. Now I'm going to, once again, drop about 1/8 of an inch from that point, okay? And then taper on out from that point to the tip of the shoulder. And then once again, on the other side, taper out to the old neckline from that 1/8 of an inch. And this looks to be a scant 1/8 of an inch right here, so that's how much we're going to deduct right along the shoulder and then taper it on out to the shoulder tip. So now we can actually start trimming. Trim that shoulder first, tapering off on that shoulder tip. And then I'm going to trim away the old neckline, so we're going to cut right along our new neckline. And now we come to the part where we're actually going to cut along one of the dart legs to that tiny tip, remembering not to slice all the way through. And then we're going to follow that line. So we're going to use this dart leg all the way to the tip of the dart, but not through it, leaving that hinge joint. Now, once again, we're going to take this sort of side portion of our pattern piece and rotate it underneath the other half of the pattern such that the neckline becomes closed at that dart, right? You're completely closing the neckline dart. And then we're going to tape that shut. And once again, you can see that that excess from the neckline has been transferred to the waistline dart right there. So I'm just going to go ahead and tape that closed as well to maintain the shape of this dart. So our back pattern piece is now all modified and we're ready to actually place it on a separate sheet of pattern paper, retrace it, add our seam allowances, and once again we are going to be adding a center back seam because we need a place for the zipper to go for our peplum blouse. So here's my bodice front and my bodice back. I have not added any seam allowances to these pieces yet. I'm going to go ahead and add my notches and do my facings first just before I do my seam allowances. Either way is fine. Just make sure that when you do your notches that you're lining up along the actual stitching line and not the seam allowance. So what we're going to do to make our notches, first I'll go ahead and do the shoulders. What we're going to do is we're going to take the back shoulder dart and we're going to fold it out. And then I'm going to have it line up with the bodice front, neckline edges together. Now I want to demonstrate, don't put your actual notch right across the center of the seam like this, because that's kind of ineffectual. You want to either leave it to the right or the left. So I'm going to go and put mine right after the dart leg, and you're just going to draw across these pattern pieces. And then we have the same task to do for the side seams of our bodice pieces. So first off, we need to fold down the dart for the bodice front, and then you want to sort of lay everything out such that those stitching lines are meeting and everything sits nicely together. And then you can go ahead and make your notches. So I'm going to do one sort of just above the dart, and then I'm going to do another one right below. And I'm going to do a double notch there. Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and actually make a facing along that neckline edge. Now you don't necessarily need to have a facing if you just want to do a full lining with no facing. But maybe you want to do a facing and then a lining. So this is optional. The primary thing you want to decide for your facing is how wide you want it to be. And I would say maybe let's do 1.5 inches. So I've gone ahead and etched out my back facing edge right here. This was the width of it, measuring 1.5 inches down from my neckline at various points. But I want to point out a couple things. You'll see that I've drawn two lines here, okay? One of them is right and one of them is wrong, and I want to point out the reason. So if we actually make our back neck facing with our dart lying open, like so, we'll get the first line. But that's not the correct line, because our actual garment and we'll have a finished look where the dart is actually stitched closed, right? And we want our facing to resemble the contours of our actual garment as closely as possible so that they lie nicely against one another, right? We don't want any bubbling or anything. So in order to do that, we need to draft our facing such that the dart is closed, okay? And then we get the second line, because once this is closed, measuring 1.5 inches down, we get a further distance down here. And you also may be wondering, well, why aren't we including the dart in the facing? Well, I want to point out something that's very important. The facing is actually chopping through part of the dart, okay? Whenever you bisect a dart, even if it's just the tip, you don't need the dart. It's gone. It's not necessary. We've intercepted the dart. It means we don't need it, but we still need to fold it out to get something that's going to accurately line up with the actual garment. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now what we can do is we can just take our back pattern piece and we can trace off our back facing, okay, by just folding out that dart and tracing along these lines, and then we'll end up having our back facing piece. So now we're going to do the same thing in the front for our front facing. We're going to do a facing of 1.5 inches. So we're just going to measure out from the neckline again at various points, 1.5 inches, and etching out our facing, and actually transfer this to some pattern paper. So here we have the back facing traced off, and I've gone ahead and traced off the front facing as well, remembering we're not going to add a seam allowance to the center front. That's going to be placed on the fold. And now what we're going to do is make our notches in the shoulder area where these meet. So all I've done is I've just folded the front facing on that shoulder edge, on that seam line, line it up on the stitching line with the back, like so. Again, I don't want to mark right in the center for my notch, but I'm going to mark the inner edge. So here are all the pattern pieces, all traced, transferred, and all seam allowances and critical information added. So I just want to draw your attention to actually the bodice front and bodice back sort of neckline areas. You can see that there's little dotted lines that I added. Well, that's just where the actual facings would be, okay? And I went ahead and marked their width on my pattern pieces because I intend to do a lining, and just having this information here is going to make constructing the lining easier. I mean, all I really have to do now is lay this out on some fabric using the same pieces and just, you know, add a seam allowance above that little dotted line. So that's just to make things easier on my part that I included that bit of info. Also, I'll go ahead and mention I went and put a few little notches on the center front and the center back, you know, just to help things line up. Although the center front, because we're placing it on the fold, it's really not necessary at all. But if you're doing a single pattern layout where you flip this on your fabric, sometimes that can be helpful in terms of lining things up. That's about it for this part of the bodice. I will have another video posted soon, which will be about drafting the peplum for this bodice. And I do want to mention once again that if this is your first time sort of trying out this technique in terms of removing any sort of excess from the neckline and transferring, and you're not really sure how it's going to fit, if these guidelines are going to work for you, go ahead, make up a muslin, and you can see if there's still some gaping, or maybe that the neckline is a little too tight, then you can easily use the technique that I taught you, whereby you transfer either the excess in the neckline to the waistline dart, or heaven forbid, your neckline's too tight, you can always retransfer some of the dart, the waistline dart, back into the neckline, all right? So just experiment with it, make sure everything works. But I think it's a handy tool to use and have to sort of prevent as much gaping in the neckline as possible whenever you alter the depth of your neckline, especially from a high-rise neckline. Hopefully I will see you soon for part 2 of this where we draft the peplum, and looking forward to it. See you soon. Bye-bye.